Some things get worse with age, and others get more dangerous. We have to go back in time. It is November 2006, and one of the worst sets of all time is about to be released into the TCG. This being the somewhat underwhelming Cyber Dark Impact. Now, this set alone would release a moderately interesting to say roster of cards. However, there will be cards that would be meta-defining in the future, such as Instant Fusion. However, this set released a strange wave of cards that would become somewhat interesting as it would pioneer a new strategy, but also become problematic as the game would evolve. And with that alone, we would have to move into what these cards were, as the cards that were released were known as their title, Barrier Statues. Now, Barrier Statues as an entire, theme, because they don't have support cards, the Barrier Statue grouping of cards revolves around level 4 monsters with 1,000 attack and 1,000 defense, and they all share a very specific effect, which reads as follows: neither player can summon monsters except, and that means their corresponding attribute of type monsters. Now, at first, this card and these cards sound insane, as this is basically a floodgate effect that locks opponents into one type of monster or another. In the case of the Barrier Statues, this was true, as attribute locking at the time, although interesting, didn't necessarily matter, as if we look at the metagame at the time, and also if you just look at the past, although monotyping cards existed and monotyping decks did exist, there wasn't really a reason to do it, as most decks at the time were still good stuff decks and or designed with a theme around it that, although may have had some type of theming in terms of their attributes, they were also able to play a widespread removal, as in 2006, a lot of decks weren't like how they were in the modern day. Instead of streamlining and having speed, they focused on manipulation and also advantaging out the opponent, as this would somewhat be referred to as like Caveman Yu-Gi-Oh! However, it's a period of time with an interesting design. And the Barrier Statues, although sounding absolutely insane in the modern day, were not really that important in the past, as although they would pioneer a new term that had already existed but would actually have monsters to fit the deck, being the stun decks, Barrier Statues themselves didn't see as much play in the metagames. And in the case of most, there's very sparing reasons as to why. Now, when we look at the Barrier Statues themselves, one of their biggest weaknesses is obviously their stats, as in a 1-to-1 metagame, it's normal summoning a 1,000 attack monster, even with an absurd effect. If it couldn't be protected, it was good as gone, as any of the good vanilla monsters at the time that could be summoned in decks, or even monsters with attacks above 1,000, would simply be able to deal with a statue. And unfortunately, that basically meant it was a waste on a normal summon, as +1 advantages in the past were very important, and I wouldn't want to waste a card simply based on the fact that I thought I could turn out a floodgate if my opponent just normal summons a monster and runs it over. The stats of the Barrier Statues have them having low attack and defense. However, they are backed up with a strong floodgate effect. However, one weakness they share is there is no synergy between them. And the reason that this is important is that as a theme, the Barrier Statues don't actually work together. So running them in a single deck is actually kind of a bad idea, as you can't really benefit by summoning one and then summoning another, because if they are of the different types, meaning one's the water or one's the wind, they can't do anything for you. So no synergy is not a good thing. And unfortunately, for that reason alone, the Barrier Statues would sit on the sidelines for a long time, seeing only very sparingly usages in decks as maybe rogue techs, or maybe even as the stun deck mentioned before. However, we'd have to advance in time to see, as one of the Barrier Statues would finally see mainstream play. After an insane amount of time, 15 years later, we would finally receive an archetype that was fully able to utilize the power of one of the Barrier Statues, and, in this case, would be able to use it to its full potential. Now, before I begin with this, I must explain that there was a time where this Barrier Statue, the specific one, did see play. However, this was not necessarily the most optimal, and I'm talking about with Samorg, the Bird of Divinity, as this card was amazing and was able to turbo out the Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds. It didn't necessarily mean that the Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds was optimal in this position, as unfortunately one of the big weaknesses with the Bird of Divinity and the Simorglock is that it did tailor into decks, as it was technically an engine. It wasn't always able to utilize it to its full potential because of the restrictions that Simorg the Bird of Divinity possessed. Now, by all means, it was a busted card, but what I'm trying to say is, unfortunately, it wasn't able to maximize its potential here. And with its banning, Simorg the Bird of Divinity basically was irrelevant, and the Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds sat on the sideline. But more importantly, let's get into what we're here for, and that's Burst of Destiny. Now, Burst of Destiny, funny enough, is the core set that would warp this Barrier Statue into power, but with one of the most funny looking archetypes in terms of it being such a dominant and powerful typing. And what I am trying to talk about is Fluanderees. Now, these birds are absolutely adorable, but don't let them fool you. They are terrifying. And because of what they were able to do, they would absolutely terrify the meta. As in the case of Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds, it finally found an archetype that was basically its best friend. And what I mean is, up until this point, Barrier Statues for the most part had been hitting. And until we received Simorg the Bird of Divinity, the Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds was the only Barrier Statue that was actually usable in widespread play, as it was now able to be turboed out from the deck. But Fluanderees did something even better. It finally gave us a way to search out the Stormwinds and actually utilize it in its full capacity. Now, if we look at the Fluanderees archetype as a whole, it was basically designed in a way that basically says, hello, friend, to Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds. Is its ability to normal summon out Winged Beast monsters, and with the effect of Robina to even search out level 4 or lower Winged Beast monsters. This was absolutely fantastic, as Stormwinds met the requirement, and you could essentially have it as a 3 of if you wanted, or as a 1 of to be searched out. And in the case of the deck itself, it was able to be paired so well, as since the archetype lacked the usage of special summoning, it was fantastic with Pot of Duality, all the pot cards that really were able to search out. And most importantly, it didn't care about special summoning, so this was not a pain to you. And essentially, Stormwinds could be found in a multitude of ways, essentially meaning if you want to just stick it on the field by itself, it could become a problem. But one of the issues that Fluanderees took care of by itself was how to protect Stormwinds. Now, Stormwinds would be protected by one of the most interesting cards that found use in this archetype, being Rise of the Mega Monarch. Rise of the Mega Monarch being a winged beast, but also being able to bounce cards to the opponent's top of the deck through its effect, meant that this card was absolutely absurd in terms of protecting the Stormwinds. Now, the reason why is that the Stormwinds would essentially lock your opponent into wind attributes, and unless they were playing the mirror match or had some type of wind deck, the moment that Ryza hit the field through Dreaming Town, it was able to bounce those cards away, effectively telling your opponent if they had no way to special summon out wind monsters, the game was over, or if they were able to blow out the board, they'd have to do it then. And effectively, Ryza protected the Stormwinds, and for an amazing amount of time, this would be the main usage of Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds. And as amazing as this was, it didn't mean that Fluanderees was necessarily a tier 0 deck or even a tier 2 deck. It was actually a tier 1 deck, but the point was statue was an unfair thing that it was able to utilize, and it did what it did well. However, too much of a good thing is a bad thing, and this couldn't last forever. As we would approach February 2023, after 2 years of running around with this powerful deck, we would finally see the first hit, and unfortunately the first hit for Fluanderees was the loss of one of its best friends. And on that February 2023 ban list, we would see Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds get banned. Now, a lot of times when we talk about decks and we talk about cards, one of the things that usually pop up is the absolute brokenness of a card. But in the case of the Barrier Statues, it's a very weird thing, as although these cards are absolutely absurd in terms of the modern concept of being a floodgate, they didn't necessarily see any play until recently. And I do mean recently. Whether this is a footnote in history for Yu-Gi-Oh! Or more or less, just showing the absolute absurdity of power creep, we can find out that the Barrier Statues, as a whole, have flaws in themselves. However, for the first time, they were exploited, and this led to their own destruction. And in the case of Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds, Its death was by its own design. This is Brad from the Ad Army signing off, and for all of you out there to sign on.